We have a pretty deep bench on this issue. It's a huge priority for us. And so my colleague, Tad Stanke, who is a real expert on religious freedom, is going to pinch hit for Eric. And I want to say a few words about him. Tad joined Human Rights First in 2008 as the director of our Fighting Discrimination program, and he's currently our director of policy and programs. Prior to joining us, Tad worked at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 7 years, where he served as Deputy Executive Director for Policy as well as Acting Executive Director twice, in 2002 and in 2007. He led the Commission's effort to strengthen U.S. foreign policy to advance the right to freedom of religion and belief. He participated in fact-finding missions in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and served on official U.S. delegations to human rights conferences of the OSCE and the United Nations. He has served as an expert on international human rights law and training officials from the Departments of State, Justice, and Homeland Security. He was a research fellow and lecturer at Columbia Law School, and early in his career, an associate at Clary Gottlieb. He has a JD from Columbia Law School, and he clerked for Judge Wilfred Feinberg from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. He's authored a number of articles on religious freedom, and next week he'll be testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee at a hearing on religious freedom in Egypt. So take it away, Tad.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. It's certainly not every day that your boss has to get up in front of everyone and say nice things about you, so I appreciate that. We have a great panel. Does religious pluralism have a future in the Middle East? And let me introduce you to our excellent panelists. On my left is Dr. Habib Malik, who's Associate Professor of History and Cultural Studies at the Lebanese American University. Immediately on my right is Dr. Hisham Helyer, non-resident fellow with the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World at the Brookings Institution, and also an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies in London. And then on the end on my right is Mohammed El-Manshawi, who is the director of the Languages and Regional Studies program at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. So to get us started, Habib, let me turn to you and ask you if you could maybe help us understand the current situation of religious pluralism in the region. We see a lot of headlines about the situation for Christians and others, a dire situation. We have a lot of political change, a lot of unrest in the Middle East, and religion playing a greater role in politics in the Middle East. So I'm wondering if you could help us understand some of the dynamics, some of the challenges that non-Muslims are facing currently in the region.
Thank you. I'll try to do that maybe from the podium.
Sure.
Once again, thank you very much, Human Rights First, for having me, and for allowing me to speak about an important and sobering topic. Religious pluralism in the Middle East today is not in good shape. My quick answer to the question, does it have a future, is I certainly hope so. From the perspective of native non-Muslim communities, specifically Christians in the region, the so-called Arab Spring has sadly and alarmingly metamorphosed into a kind of Salafi or Jihadi spring. Alongside the disturbing development of accelerated Sunni Shiite violent sectarian confrontation. We see this in Iraq, we see it in Syria, and we see also a rise in extremist thought and behavior in Egypt as well. So the alarm over the future of Christians in the Middle East and also of religious pluralism is very real. It's not an exercise in hallucination. We're talking basically about 10 to 12 million native Arab Christians. And we're also talking about two very distinct historical narratives. About 90% of these Christians in the region have at some point or other in the last 1,300 years succumbed to a second-class status in their own communities and have lost considerable freedoms as a result. It is basically known as the dhimmi system, which means being accepted as non-Muslims in a Muslim majority context and being protected, but in return for submitting to a number of restrictions. And as I said, that's about 90% of the native Christians of the region. The remaining 10% or so are relatively freer. They managed at great cost in terms of both blood and treasure to preserve some degree of freedom. And they mostly tend to exist in Lebanon and have benefited from the rugged topography of that region, among other things. The native Christians in the region really face no good choices these days in the ongoing confrontation between the repressive dictatorial regimes and some Islamist oppositions, or between, if you will, Iranian and Saudi Arabian interests and proxies. So, on the whole, unfortunately, sadly, the term collateral damage does apply to these communities. The accusations that we read sometimes that the Christians, for instance, in Syria support the Assad regime are both inaccurate and tendentious. They really all their choices are really bad choices. And very often they have to undertake the painful choice of choosing the lesser, in their view, of two evils. And then that choice turns out to be an evil in itself. Iraqi Christians, after 2003, the community there was largely decimated, cut down to about half, and that was on America's watch. Lebanon's Christians experienced something similar over a longer period of time earlier, from 75 to 1990. Egypt's Copts, about 8 to 10%, I mean, we have two Egyptian experts, they'll tell us more, have been under sustained attacks. And, you know, to be fair to the picture, and also, I suppose, to the former Morsi government, the Copts have been under attack both during the Morsi period and before and since. So there is no, there's no specific singling out of anyone there. Churches have been burned, individuals and families attacked during weddings or during funerals, and forced conversions and so forth. I think, just to end very quickly, my view of this is that we are facing really a crisis of Islamic and specifically Sunni moderation. The Sunnis from Morocco to Indonesia are obviously the majority. Even all of the Shiites, including Iran, are a minority in an ocean of Sunni Islam. And Sunnis have been in power consistently ever since the dawn of Islam. I am a person who believes that Sunni moderation is real, and it does exist. And the vast majority of people are precisely that. They just want to get on with their day like everybody else. However, it just takes a small, vocal, and violent extremist group to intimidate and cow well-meaning Muslims into silence or inaction. And so then the question is, how do we chart a future for religious pluralism in the region? We have to strengthen moderation, and specifically Sunni moderation. One last point. If, in fact, we are witnessing today in the Middle East a devolution of the region somehow back into its primordial ethno-sectarian tribal aggregates, if that's in fact what historians will write about this period in the future, then the resulting fragmentation of the region and the perhaps vanishing of the neat arrangements that go back perhaps certainly in the Levant to the Sykes-Picot era after the First World War and so on. You can even look at the map and see how artificial it is in many places. There are these straight lines running through the desert, nobody knows why. And that map it overlays, you see, the basic ethno-religious map of the region. If the underlying map is reasserting itself and fragmentation will follow, I think the way forward would be to try and think creatively in terms of reassembling these communities along perhaps federal lines, a kind of bottom-up approach. In my view, heterogeneity demands a federal, not a unitary, solution and accommodations. And let me just end by saying, however you cut it, religious cleansing sets a horrible precedent anywhere in the world. And any country that has influence and clout, like the United States, ought not to allow it, ought to do anything it can to stop this. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Habib. Let me turn to Hisham next. And Habib, you've thrown a lot of things out there. Arab Spring, majority, minority dynamics, Sunni-Shia conflict. You've been following the political upheavals for the last few years in the Middle East. How do you see the dynamics there playing themselves out, not just for non-Muslims, but for Muslims as well, and for the political future of the region?
Well, thank you very much, Tad, for bringing up those questions, and also for Human Rights First for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to an audience this august. I've been very impressed with the discussions that have taken place so far, and it's something of a challenge to be the last panel of such a stimulating couple of days, but unfortunately not the last person to speak. So, Mohammed, you get the brunt later on. There is a lot to discuss, and I wanted to take a few specific points, and then I'm sure that we'll get into these in more detail during discussions. The first is this concept between minority and majority. And I think that we ought to consider that majorities and the concept of majorities and the concept of minorities is really about power. And this is how it's developed over history. You can have very powerful demographic minorities, and you can have very powerless demographic majorities. And that's something to throw out there just in terms of how we think about these sorts of things as we go forward. The Alawite minority in Syria historically has been a powerful one during the 20th century, particularly the latter half of the 20th century, more so than, politically speaking, the Sunni majority. The Sunni minority in Iraq was more powerful than the Shiite majority, and so on. And I think that it's important that we bring that up so that we can try to get to where we want to go. And I personally hope that we try to get to a point where we stop thinking in terms of majorities and minorities, where that's actually possible, and where we start talking about citizens and citizenship. And many may believe that that's something of a pipe dream, that that's very unrealistic and idealistic. But particularly in a room like this, where we've heard these quite inspirational stories over the last couple of days, I would like to think that particularly in a region where 3 years ago nobody dreamed that what could have happened in places like Egypt over 18 days, in Tahrir, and other places in the region, nobody thought that that would have been possible. So maybe we should take the opportunity to dare to dream. You mentioned other Muslim minorities, and I think that the Sunni-Shia tension that has been building up over the past 3 years, that has really been bottled up for a while, I think that we have to regard these with a great degree of seriousness. And the war against Bashar al-Assad in Syria has turned into a very sectarian conflict, thanks to the use of sectarianism from the outset by the regime. And now others among his opponents seem to be competing to see who can be more sectarian and abuse sectarian rhetoric for the purposes of political ends. And that kind of sectarian genie is very difficult to put back in the bottle. And it's obviously not a very positive development in the slightest, and we've seen that effect across the region. In Egypt, for example, we saw a huge amount of sectarian rhetoric in the past year between Sunnis and Shias, which was tolerated very openly and very easily by the Morsi government, I have to say. And Shia Egyptians died as a result of what can only be described as a lynching, only weeks before Morsi's ouster by the military. So conflicts between minority and majority groupings do indeed have repercussions, particularly when they devolve into issues of violence and incitement. And Habib very rightly pointed out one type of incitement, which I think is very important, the incitement that is aimed at Christian communities within the region. And again, I'll limit my comments primarily to Egypt, because it's where I spend a lot of my time. That sort of incitement has been going on, not simply over the last few months or even the past few years. It's gone far beyond that. But the last couple of years have been particularly distasteful and damaging. The rise of a more virulent form of political Islamism, I think, is something to keep a watch of, particularly when it comes to incitement. And it results in the burning of churches. It results in civil strife. It results in attacks on weddings and funerals and so forth. And the popular coup that took place earlier this summer led to a large number of protests and marches by Islamists supporting President Mohamed Morsi. And those marches also often devolved into using sectarian rhetoric and incitement vis-a-vis Coptic Egyptians. And something we might not know, or something that we might not talk about that much, is also the responsibility of the authorities to actually deal with the security threat that faces those communities. And very often, Christian communities in Egypt complain about the very lax attitude they get with regards to the authorities on protecting them against these sorts of threats, and how that responsibility is often shirked. And I think that's something that we also need to put out there on the table for discussion. But another type of incitement, which I think is important for us to consider as we go through this discussion, is precisely the issue of incitement against other types of what we now see are other kinds of minorities. And they're not necessarily the religious ones. We've been having this discussion over the last couple of days, but definitions aside, whether or not Islamists that support Morsi in Egypt at present can be considered to be a religious minority, I personally don't think so. But it's still incitement against a minority within a country, a demographic minority that is politically quite powerless. And that has led to an incredible amount of dehumanization and demonization over the past few months, which in turn has allowed for certain atrocities to take place. And I think that that's also something very important for us to consider. During the 6-week interval between the ouster of Morsi and the clearing of the Rab'a sit-in, on August 14th, we saw throughout Egyptian media that sort of rhetoric being given completely a free hand, and that had consequences. And if nothing else, we ought to consider that when we have these discussions around minorities and majorities, discourse, rhetoric, it's not just words. It's not just words. Words have prices, and the price of some words can actually be blood. Okay. And I think that that's something very important to keep in mind. And with that, I'll turn over to Mohammed.
Great. So thank you, Hisham. Mohammed, you're here in Washington. I know you've written a lot about Egypt and elsewhere in the region. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to anything that Habib and Hisham have put out there, but also from your perch here and at the Middle East Institute, what do you see at stake for the United States in this picture, which is not a pretty one? And why should Americans care? What should the U.S. be thinking about in terms of approaching this problem?
Sure. First, I want to thank Human Rights First for this opportunity. But before heading to U.S. role in this dilemma, I will just hint on Egypt, which I am Egyptian American, and I will claim I know one or two things about it. First, when we talk about Egypt, we have to recognize that it's about 85 million. 40% of them can't read or write in their own language. So this is a crisis. It's not new thing. It's a disease no government were able or willing to take it seriously, and that's and important to know in the context I'm talking about. And 65% of Egyptians are under age of 30 years old. So it's a very useful country, very poor, very illiterate, as I said, 40% can't read or write in their language. So they are very much easy target for any influence. And the easiest influence in this region, in this part called Egypt, is religion, whether Christianity or Islam. Egyptians are in romance with religion for thousands of years. And this country changed their religious domination 3 times, from pharaonic beliefs to Christianity. All Egyptians were Christian at one point for hundreds of years. Then about 90% or less or more are converted to Islam for a reason or another, but they change their religion and they are in romance with the religion, whether it's Christian or Muslim. And any talk about separation of state and church, or religion and state, it's fantasy in the region, especially in Egypt. Religion is part of the life. It won't disappear. It's part of the political game, of the competition. It won't disappear. It's open field for everybody. Everybody should use it, because you will lose it if you won't use it. So criticizing Islamist or church for playing a role is very naive, because it will be there and you can't neutralize or ignore. Like money, you can't ignore money in politics. You can't ignore religious in politics in a country like Egypt. And I like the word Habib mentioned about native Egyptians, calling the Christian native. No, I believe everybody is native in Egypt, whether they are Christian or Muslim, because they convert religion for a reason or another, but they are all native. Native doesn't apply for this population of this region. It's very much American thing, Native American. But Middle Eastern is there for years, for thousands of years, so there's no such a thing called native Egyptians. And Egypt before the Arab Spring, so during, I will say, since 1970, witnessed this ugly sectarianism, with return of millions of Egyptians from the Gulf. A lot of Egyptians, middle class, upper class, lower class, Muslim and Christian alike, traveled as a labor to the Gulf, Saudi and other Emiratis, after the oil wells flooded them, and they returned with very conservative social behavior. Most Egyptians in 60s, my mother's generation, they don't cover their hair, and I'm Muslim, and my family is Muslim. None of them did that, but everybody did it in the last 30 years. I went to college. I graduated in Cairo University in 1992. From 100 class students, 50% were females. I believe we have the graduation picture. 3, 4 were veiled. When I go to Egypt, we'll meet for reunion once a year. About 45 of them are veiled. So dramatic change in Egypt, and I believe there is influence from neighboring countries, mainly Saudi Arabia, that encourage this form of Salafi or Wahhabi teaching, which very much affects Egyptians, especially people who spend years there under this repressive regime in Saudi Arabia without any rights. And Mubarak regime definitely and systematically discriminated against Christians. That's no secret. As of today, Egyptian intelligence service has no Christian, 0. Not even a driver, a T-boy, a cleaner, forget being officer or analyst. There is no such thing in Egypt as of today. And this is a shame, but it was a fact during Mubarak, during Morsi, during SCAF, during Sisi now, and I believe it will last, because the culture of these institutions, security institutions, are very much anti-Christian for a reason or another, but I'm just telling you what is the story there. And Mubarak systematically harassed or discriminated Christians for his own political gains. However, he as well discriminated against Islamists. Any Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic figure was banned from joining the government in high rank. Security apparatus as well vacant from Christians. However, it's vacant from Islamists as well. So discrimination was not limited to Christians under Mubarak. It was for Islamists as well. They have legitimate political parties just after Mubarak was ousted 3 years ago. And under this regime, the state was very strong compared to society. So everything was state-run. The privilege of the state distributed to whoever they favor. And the state was very weak. And this very much changed in the February 11th, when the protesters successfully take Mubarak regime down, or at least the head of the regime. And first phase of transition under SCAF, the Supreme Council of Military Forces, we have very significant new realities in terms of religious freedom and for Christians and for Muslim and Islamist as well. We have freedom for Islamists who were banned from political sphere, from political parties. They were allowed to have a political party, Islamist, meaning Muslim Brotherhood, and Salafist, who have dozens of these parties. And SCAF as well released a lot of violent extremist prisoners who were spending time in jail, and he or SCAF released them for a lot of reasons. I believe it's to use the fear factor of Islamization of Egypt. And there was an important date in 2011, the October 9th and 10th, where thousands of Christian youth protested publicly, and that was without the permission of the church, which is very weird for Egyptian Christians who are very much listening to the church in every little affairs in their life. They protested the burning of the church in downtown Cairo, and they gathered by thousands in front of the national TV building, and the military cracked down on them and killed at least 30 people in live broadcast in national TV. A lot of Egyptian media personnel called for the people of Egypt to go protect the military and the army from these protesters who are Christian. And this was significant because first time we saw such a thing. We have discrimination, we have a lot of violence against Christian here and there, but not to call in people by national government TV to go to protect the military from these protesters who were Christians, and the cross was carried by a lot of them. And the Pope of the Coptic Church passed away a few months later, Pope Shenouda, historical figure. And the military, I believe, tried to give a hand again to Christian by announcing that 3 days mourning for Egypt. That was very important notice by the military, and a lot of Christians were satisfied with this move. Then we have first time ever in the Middle East, or Egypt to that matter, free election. And free election, we like it or not, brought Islamists to power. In the parliament, they won about 71% between Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi. And the president was first free elected in the region, in Egypt, was Muslim Brotherhood head. And that was very significant for Egypt. And it was not exception for the region. The region, we like it or not, the mood is Islamic. Anywhere from this area, from Morocco to Indonesia, you have fair, free election. The outcome is Islamic. The mood is Islamic. The only thing that easy and smartly used to make communities and provide service and feeling the identity is Islam. We like it or not, that's a different story, but this is the reality. Jordan, Palestine, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, name it. You have free election by Western standards, the outcome is Islamic. You have to be ready to deal with this. Otherwise, let's not call for democracy here. And Christian under Morsi didn't have good time. Didn't have under Mubarak, nor SCAF, and Morsi was no exception. He comes from a political party and group that has Islamic flavor, Islamic reference definitely, and they want to paint Egypt the way they are. It's more Islamic, and that's of course upsetting the Christian and anyone who is not agreeing with them. But I believe the church played an important role before the election of Morsi when they called for their followers to give their vote to the opposite figure, Ahmad Shafiq, a figure from Mubarak regime. So it was very bad choice. There was no good choice left for them, I agree, but to bring somebody from the other regime that oppressed you already, that was very not good chance. And under Morsi, Egypt adopted a constitution, which is very much Islamic constitution, and I will go to this point before I close, because we have a new constitution now. Then Morsi was ousted in the July 3rd by the military, in obviously military coup. And here, I believe, it was a historical mistake by the head of the church, a new pope called Tawadros. He stands next to the head of the military Egyptian army, Sisi, and the head of the Al-Azhar institutions, the biggest Sunni institution in the world. Both of them supported the coup. And I believe both of them are unfortunately choose the wrong path. They should stay aside and be mediator for this crisis, not to be a part of it, not choose side in the day one. I prefer, in this dilemma we have in Egypt, this crisis, to go to the church and the mosque to ask how we fix it. Let's go solve it. But they stand in day one, the head of Al-Azhar, the head of the church, next to the general, Sisi, and they took a side from day one. And as we know, there's a lot of church burning after that, and there is no serious investigation, and there is no serious question why the military and the police doesn't protect the churches and who did it. Very much, a lot of you believe Islamist. I have reasons to believe it's more mere security apparatus just to defame and gaining support. Because if you look at any Egyptian official talking to the West, they call this case burning churches in order to discredit Islamists and accusing them. And I believe the security apparatus in Egypt has very bad record protecting churches and Christians and abusing them. So I won't avoid this possibility. I have no proof, of course, but it may not be really Islamist. And the military and the Egyptian government media incite a lot of violence against Christians even after the military coup in order to gain popularity and make people fear of Islamists, and they are very much succeeded in that. Egypt, or the newly appointed government by the military, have a new constitution 3 days ago, just published 3 days ago, and it has good and bad news. The good news is there is more freedom, more rights for everybody, including Christians, including youth, including women, including disabled people. That's the first time they have these articles, and freedom of belief for everybody. But everybody in Egypt means the Abrahamic religion, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The rest are not to be considered. And that's very much supported by the Egyptian church, Egyptian Islamic community, and the 20 Jews left in Egypt. So it's very much societal agreement to limit the freedom of expression and beliefs to these three religions. The Baha'i, the Buzi, the atheists are not to be found in anywhere in Egypt in terms of rights and responsibility. And that's, as I will like it or not, a different story, but it's not there. However, Egypt witnessed a very historical day last month. Remember this day because Egyptian history will mention it. In November 10th, first time ever, a person who's 25 years old showed up in Egyptian TV, who is atheist and doesn't believe in God, in public talk show. That was very significant. It was the talk of the city for days. We have an atheist in Egyptian TV talking about his argument. He was mistreated by the talk show host, by the people who phoned the program, but it was very significant to have such a thing. Atheist in the Egyptian TV marked this day, November 10th, because that was very important. The new constitution have some rights for everybody, including Christians, and have some good article to make the government obliged to all international treaties they signed, and they have good record in that, but they don't respect it, but they sign it. So here we have a window to challenge some government behavior, and we have missing opportunity in the last 3 years to focus, as Hisham said, the citizenship rights. I believe it's very naive and short-sighted to talk about minority rights in Egypt or anywhere. You have to talk about citizenship rights. Calling minority in Egypt victimized and are a victim all the time, it doesn't help in the last 30 years, and it won't help. What it will help is to end the repressive regime as a tyranny in Egypt and have free democracy. Free democracy will guarantee the right for everybody. And having this quota or article for protecting one minority youth, it's, I believe, naive. What we need is a real democratic system, democratic beliefs that have the right for everybody equally, woman, man, Christian, Muslim, shouldn't matter. And in terms of United States, which that's what I should talk about, I believe they should stay silent, because any interference of the United States in terms of protecting minority or Christians, it's counterproductive in the region and hurts more than make any good gain. It doesn't prove any good, and they don't have any good record in the last 30 years. This dilemma of interest and belief and the principle is hurting the United States. We have beautiful relations with Saudi Arabia. We never talk about Shia in Saudi Arabia, but we have great interest there. We don't talk about that. In Egypt as well, we keep silent about a lot of harassment against Christians and against, as I said, Islamists. and that doesn't make any good. So until we fix this credibility problem between principle and interest, we shouldn't talk or advise as a government what to do. And here, we have this annual report by State Department, beautiful report every year about religious freedom, for example, but a few weeks later, you will see another report, global terrorism or counter-terrorism. In one report for religious freedom, they will punish Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but in the other report, they will say great word about these two regimes incorporating, fighting global terrorism. So it's really losing credibility of not talking the talk and walking the walk. And you talk to American officials about these issues, they tell you, oh, we talk to them behind closed door. Closed door policy doesn't work in the region. Unless you will talk publicly about your conversation with Saudi leaders about equal right for all citizens, regardless of religion, you shouldn't mention anything. And I will stop here.
Great, thank you. So Hisham, I want to deliver on your promise about optimism here. We've heard a lot of things that don't sound very optimistic. But what can be done? If we can just very quickly, maybe 1 minute each, what can create an enabling environment for religious pluralism in the region, whether it's by regional actors or do you agree about the U.S. government and its role?
I actually don't. No, I think the United States can do a lot more than what it's doing without endangering or radioactively embracing the minorities. Let me just say that America does have a negative image in the region, and there are justifications for that. Some reasons for that are tendentious and propagated by America's enemies, but some are self-inflicted wounds. What the United States needs to do is to align the rhetoric with the action. And what I mean by that is religious pluralism is not just a quantitative assessment of religious variety. What it should be is a qualitative focus on an authentic and free expression of the various diverse components. In order to have that,